Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I'm going to do the second video in changing a percent to a fraction and a decimal. And we're going to look at percents that are really, really small. And these are probably the trickiest questions we'll have done in the last week or two. So we're going to look at the first question, 35 hundredths of a percent. Now, no matter what the percent is, when you're starting with a percent and changing it to a fraction, it's always going to be out of 100. Now here's the issue. A lot of people look at this and they go, okay, that's easy. Out of 100, okay, well that's 35 out of 100. But that's not what 35 hundredths of a percent is. If you were to do 35 out of 100, that's 35%. And this right here is not the same as this. This is this one right here is as a small percentage. It's, if you were thinking of test scores, that's not a test score you'd want to get. This percentage is tiny. It's below 1%. So they're very different. So that's not correct. So if you're thinking of shading squares on a hundreds grid, if you have 35 hundredths of a percent, that's going to be taking one little square and shading in about 1/3 of it. So the way we write this is we actually write this as 0 and 35 hundredths out of 100. Now, that's the correct math, but it's not in the correct form. We can't have a decimal in a fraction like that. So what we want to have happen is we want this decimal to, or this numerator to become a whole number, and we can do that by moving the decimal 2 spots to the right behind the 5. And then we'll get the numerator as 35. Now the way we can do that is mentally multiply by 100. And that will shift the decimal 2. And that gives us the numerator of 35. Now, we're allowed to do that just as long as we multiply the denominator by 100. Now, a quick way to multiply 100 times 100. 1 times 1 is 1. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. So we're going to have 1 times 1 is 1. And then 4 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that fraction is 35 over 10,000. Which makes sense because this is a very small percent. This should be a very small fraction. Now, before we reduce this to lowest terms, look at the number of zeros on 10,000, right? Whenever we have the fraction out of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, then we can do the decimal. There's going to be 4 decimal spots. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we need to have 35 10,000ths. So this is the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths, the 10,000ths. We have to put the 35 there, 0 placeholder, 0 placeholder, and 0 in front. 35 10,000ths is the decimal. And that makes sense because that's a very small decimal, very small percent, very small fraction. Now putting in lowest terms, hopefully we recognize that we can divide the numerator and denominator by 5. Okay, 35 divided by 5 is 7. And don't do 10,000 divided by 5, do 10 divided by 5. 10 divided by 5 is 2. And then there are 3 extra zeros to tack on. So 7 over 2,000 is that fraction in lowest terms, a very small fraction. So that's a grade 8 kind of question where you're dealing with a very, very small percentage. It's tricky. It's tricky. It takes some time. You really got to think about what the numbers mean. Think about the size of the number. Let's look at another one that's similar to this. I'm going to flip forward. Doink. And I'm just going to rewrite this question. My program I use doesn't let me make good fractions. So this is 23.5%. Now, 23.5%. To make this a fraction, remember percent always means out of 100. Now, if this was just 23%, this would be fine and dandy like sour candy. It would just be 23 out of 100. But it's not 23%, it's 23.5%. So this is actually correct to do this. This means 23.5 out of 100. Because percent means a fraction out of 100. Now, one of the things people get confused about here is they go, whoa, 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 Mr. Weber, isn't this already in fractional form? It's a mixed number, right? But it's actually a percent that has a fractional part. If there is no percent symbol there, then yes, that is in fraction form. But it is a percent that has a fraction in it. And that's tricky to wrap your mind around. So this is correct to say 23.5 out of 100. It's just not the correct form. So what we want to do is hopefully we recognize that this 0.5%, that's the same as saying 0 5/10%. So what I want to do is I want to take that 1/2 and I'm going to make it go away. Bye-bye 1/2. But I'm going to replace it with its decimal equivalent, 5/10. It's the same number, just with the decimal instead of the half. Now we can do what we did last time. We want this 23.5 to become a decimal. So the way I can do that is, this time I just have to I want this 23.5 to become a whole number. And that's really easy to do. All I do is shift the decimal 1 to the right. And I can do that by multiplying by 10. And if I do that at the top, I have to do to the bottom. Okay, so 23 5/10 times 10 is 235. And 100 times 10 is 1 times 1 with 3 zeros. And that's going to be out of 1,000. And there you go. And now you have a decimal, or a fraction, that looks reasonable. It's in the correct form. Now, at this point, I would make the decimal because you have it out of a magnitude of 10. There's 3 zeros, right? So that means for our decimal, you're going to have 1, 2, 3 places. And that's going to be 2, 3, 5. And a 0 placeholder in front. Now to get this in lowest terms, hopefully we recognize this ends in 5, this ends in 0, so we can divide by 5. A lot of people have trouble with this kind of division. I'm going to show you what I often tell the kids. And we'll practice this a lot this year. I'm going to move this over here to do 235 divided by 5. Okay, 235 divided by 5. Hopefully I can recognize that, 200 divided by 5 is pretty easy. And 35 divided by 5 is pretty easy. Now, 200 divided by 5 is just 20 divided by 5, tack on a 0. So that's going to be 4 and 0, 40. And 35 divided by 5 is 7. So that means 235 divided by 5 is 47. So when reducing this fraction to lowest terms, 235 divided by 5 is 47. For 1,000 divided by 5, do 10 divided by 5, and tack on 2 zeros. And there's your answer in lowest terms, 47 over 200. That kind of stuff takes some practice, and we'll practice it a lot this year. Okay, let's do one last question. I'm going to rewrite it as 8 3/5%. And we're going to turn this into a fraction. Now, a lot of people say to me, Mr. Weber, this is so easy. It's already a fraction. The answer is 8 3/5. But I say no. Okay, it's a percent because it's got the percent symbol, right? It's got this guy right here. It's a percent that has a fractional part. So whenever we're making a percent into a fraction, always remember percent means fraction out of 100. So we're going to make this out of 100. Now, if this was just 8%, this would be a super easy question. This would be 8 out of 100. But it's not just 8%, it's 8 3/5%. So this means 8 3/5 out of 100. Now, this is the correct math, but it's not the correct form. It's this 3/5 part that's the problem. So we're going to do the same thing that we did last time. Hopefully you can recognize that you can take 3/5 and make it its decimal equivalent. You might know this already, or we might have to do a little math, make it out of 10 by times by 2 times by 2. That's 6/10, and that's 0 6/10. So what I want to do then is I've made 3/5 into 6/10, so I'm going to take that 3/5, going to grab my trusty eraser, bye-bye 3/5, but I'm going to replace you with your decimal equivalent, decimal 6. And now that's still the correct math, but it's not the correct form. I can't have a decimal in the fraction like that, but I can fix that. I want to move this decimal 1 to the right because that will create a whole number, and I can do that by timesing by 10. And if I do that to the top, I have to do it to the bottom by timesing by 10. And what I get for my fraction then is I get 86 as the numerator, and I get 1,000 for the denominator. Now at that point, I want to make the decimal because I've got 3 zeros there. I've got my 1,000, 1, 2, 3. So I'll go make my decimal, 3 decimal spots, and I need to have 86 thousandths. 86 thousandths. So I need 86 in the thousandths. This is the tenths, hundredths, thousandths. And then I need to have 0 placeholder and 0 in front. And my decimal is 86 thousandths, which matches the fraction 86 out of 1,000. Now, last thing to do is lowest terms. Hopefully I can recognize dividing by 2. We were practicing that today by chopping in half. 86 chopped in half is 43. 1,000 chopped in half is 500. There you go. These kinds of questions are probably the trickiest ones. So refer back to these when you're doing ML136 numbers 8, 9, and 10. Remember, I don't expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to make an effort. I do expect you to look back at your notes or refer to these videos. Hopefully this helps. That's all for now. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.